Okay, let us know, everyone in the webinar. I think that they can hear me now. All right, welcome to the Weatherhead East Asian Institute. This is our final event of the Modern Vietnamese Studies program. So we're very, very excited to be hosting and to be holding this special panel today. But it is my job to introduce a person who really was, the heart and soul behind this event. And she is not a stranger to any of us because she has been with us for this academic year. Dr. Nguyen Vu is a first-generation scholar in French and Vietnamese studies. She earned her PhD in 2019 from Cornell University and subsequently taught at Hamilton College for 2 years before joining us here. She also has experience teaching literature and language at a number of universities, including my own alma mater, University of Pennsylvania, and abroad at the University of Paris 8. Her scholarship has appeared in the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies and Diaspora. As a postdoctoral research scholar here at Weatherhead, she will be completing her book manuscript entitled Forging Freedoms, Language, and Intellectual Thought in the 20th Century. And that was the topic of the previous event that features this panel here, in which they met for 2 hours, kind of dissecting Dr. Vu's manuscript. And I'm extremely happy to announce that Dr. Vu will be joining the Faculty of Literature at Fulbright University, Vietnam. We're extremely excited about that. As many of you know, or those of you who've been taking my class, we are starting a new partnership between Columbia University and Fulbright University, Vietnam. And I think, Dr. Vu will play a very pivotal role in this new relationship. So it's not goodbye, as we'll continue to have a lot of interaction with Dr. Vu when she becomes faculty at Fulbright University. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Vu.
Thank you, Dr. Lien-Hang, and thank you to the Weatherhead Institute for your support this year and for this event. And thank you all for joining us here in person as well as virtually. So I'd like to actually open up with some remarks that will orient our conversation today around Vietnamese intellectual history, which is something that I'm working towards developing. So this is not a typical book talk, but what I'll call a book table, in which the discussion of Dr. Martina Nguyen's book is a point of departure for a larger conversation around a number of fundamental questions to consider in our current field of Vietnam studies. And that includes, what does a Vietnamese intellectual history look like? How does it contribute or challenge existing understandings of intellectual history, both in the global sense and local sense? How can we think about intellectual history and the circulation of ideas and texts in relation to the major social and political changes in Vietnam, most notably in the 20th century? To begin, and as you will see, Dr. Martina Nguyen's investigation of the Tư Lực Văn Đoàn, with a self-reliant literary group, and the vision of a cosmopolitan nationalism shows that through their intellectual writings in the periodicals of Pham Hoa or Mores and These Days or Ngày Nay, that their literary and political agenda were intricately tied. And her scholarship of this late colonial era joins Ben Tran in the field of literature, who names this emerging generation of educated intellectuals as post-Mandarin in their engagement with new aesthetic forms that call into question those pre-existing in Vietnam. And the work of Nguyen and Tran complement those of Peter Zinnemann, Patricia Pelly, Kim Minh, Sean McHale, just to name a few, in their research on Vietnamese intellectuals, particularly after colonial independence. In more recent scholarship, the emerging work of Kevin Pham on dignity and various strategies of anti-colonial thought, as well as Cindy Nguyen's exploration of libraries as epistemic institutions with political interest, indicate promise that engagement with intellectual activity will remain integral to thinking about political theory and social history. So in light of this scholarship, one possible argument as to why Vietnamese intellectual history as a subdiscipline doesn't already exist is, well, it doesn't really need to. since so much of intellectual activity is inextricable to political and social history. Many of the intellectuals in question in the works I've already mentioned are themselves political agents. And such work might be what some scholars would call a social history of ideas. This is the notion that intellectual history, defined in a traditional sense of the interpretation of textual elements, serve the reconstruction of social histories. Now, if we think about intellectual history in this way as the interpretation of textual elements and to serve a reconstruction of other subdisciplines of history, social, cultural, political, then we would be really limiting the possibility of the work and ideas of these intellectuals to hold meanings of their own. For a place like Vietnam, in which literacy did not become popularized until the 20th century, the concept of textuality and text and interpretations of text in the traditional sense of intellectual history can be fraught and exclusionary. And in the same way, for cultures with strong oral tradition, how does one engage with intellectual history on these measures, on these definitions? For the Vietnamese, the rise of writing and text, broadly speaking, especially via print culture, only emerged out of real political and social concerns of national eradication. In a place like Vietnam, it's not possible to consider an intellectual history without this implication of other disciplines of history. These boundaries between subdisciplines cannot be so clearly defined. It's important then to open up what we mean by text and textuality and how the development of language and the circulation of ideas contribute to this larger concern for knowledge production within intellectual history. In fact, I would contend that most of the scholarship I've just mentioned above do consciously engage with the same questions that concern intellectual history around one's relationship with text, with language, more broadly speaking. These scholars consider, for example, how the Vietnamese interpreted foreign ideas in texts like republicanism or the works of André Gide that would then serve as a lens through which to view their country of Vietnam, and that would in turn interact and transform their own work as writers. Despite any differing political outlooks, the writers of the self-reliant literary group and other young intellectuals such as Nguyen, for example, shared a common concern for creating a Vietnamese canon or a collection of great texts that would be epistemic capstones for future generations. So these intellectuals were in turn creating new textualities in Vietnamese society, new relationships to language, new areas and materials for interpretation and interaction. And so in naming a Vietnamese intellectual history, I wouldn't say we're creating something entirely new, but rather we're acknowledging the important work that's already in place, that's reorienting English language scholarship, broadly speaking, to consider places like Vietnam not only as a culturally rich geography, but also as a source of continuous epistemological inquiry. It calls into question the legacy of area studies and post-colonial studies, not to disavow them, but to indicate clear progress in the development of scholarship in the fields. Establishing a Vietnamese intellectual history also opens up the possibility of contributing to what we might call a global intellectual history, which is less concerned with studying the dissemination of the West to the rest in the terms of historians Samuel Moyn and Andrew Sartori, but with ideas across spaces that don't match current maps of power. So I would propose that in the emerging scholarship in Vietnam studies that deal with intellectual activity, we might read European texts with Vietnamese texts, engage with interpretation of these Vietnamese intellectuals along with our own. And this creates space for a methodology that turns away from a documentarian approach of reconstructing the past to instead facilitate conversation and continuous inquiry in a dialogical fashion with said past. So on this note, I'll now introduce our three panelists, scholars for whom I have deep respect, who will carry on this conversation that I've just started. So first we have Dr. Martina Nguyen. She is Associate Professor of History at Baruch College. She is a historian of modern Southeast Asia, and her research focuses on colonialism, intellectual life, and social and political reform in 20th century Vietnam. Her book, On Our Own Strength, Self-Reliant Literary Group and Cosmopolitan Nationalism in Late Colonial Vietnam, which is also the subject of today's talk, published with University of Hawaii Press in 2021, employs the historical landscape of the 1930s French-occupied Vietnam as a lens for examining the relationship between cultures of the metropole and colonized societies. Set in arguably the country's most dynamic intellectual and cultural period, this book opens up today's conversation regarding intellectual engagement, activity, and history. Next, we have Dr. Claire Edington, on the other side, who is Associate Professor of History at the University of California, San Diego, and she's a historian of medicine in the French Empire with a focus on colonial and post-colonial Southeast Asia. Her research examines the way medical experts, state institutions, and popular beliefs shape the lives of marginalized people in Vietnam throughout the 20th century, which has culminated in the 2019 publication of her book with Cornell University Press, Beyond the Asylum, A Social History of Mental Illness in French Colonial Vietnam. She's essentially interested in how ideas about deviance and disease travel across cultures and what everyday exchanges between lay people and experts can tell us about history of Vietnam. And her teaching and scholarship looks beyond the text for sources of knowledge, including the body and everyday experiences, and thus placing her in a very unique position to comment on how one might redefine intellectual history. And then lastly, we have Dr. Nguyen. He is associate professor at of world cultures and literatures at the University of Houston, and he is a scholar of comparative literature between Vietnam and Europe, continental philosophy, as well as critical theory. His first book, The Unimagined Community, Imperialism and Culture in South Vietnam, published with Manchester University Press in 2020, it re-examines the political and cultural history of the Vietnam War through the largely excluded perspective of the South Vietnamese. The way that he develops the Ngo brothers' adaptation of Emmanuel Mounier's personalism during his tenure is a concrete example of how the Vietnamese worked with foreign ideas to make them their own. And his most recent publication, Walter Benjamin and the Critique of Political Economy, a New Historical Materialism, which comes out with Bloomsbury this summer, offers a new interpretation of Benjamin's philosophy of history, namely through a critique of notions of progress traceable to the Enlightenment ideals. So drawing on their expertise on different aspects of history as well as Vietnam studies, I hope that this book table will scrape the surface of what the subdiscipline of Vietnamese intellectual history may look like in the near future. So I will propose that we proceed in the following manner. So Dr. Martina Nguyen will present her book in a book talk format, and then Drs. Claire and Zui will provide their commentary, and then I will open up the discussion with a couple of questions, and then after that, we'll field questions both in person and online, and we'll try to do our best to balance those questions. Thank you very much. Do you want the microphone right here so you don't have to hold it?
Right, so, okay. How do I, oh, right. Okay, right. Give me a second while I get organized. Oh, sorry. Oh, excuse me, how do I do that?
So just we're going to.
Oh, okay.
And then there you go.
Okay, thank you so much. I didn't realize we're working across multiple platforms here, but thank you so much. Thanks, Julie. Many thanks to Dr. In Vu for the warm welcome and the introduction, and also for the invitation to share my work with you today. It was actually at her suggestion that we examine the possibility of naming a Vietnamese intellectual history, and for that I thank you for the invitation. Before I begin, I want to thank the Weatherhead for hosting this event. Many thanks to Julie Kwan for organizing all the logistics of this event, including all the technical stuff just now. I will be talking today about my book that was published last year, On Our Own Strength. And I'll be highlighting one chapter of it, the chapter based on humor as a modern sensibility. I had the honor of publishing it as part of the Weatherhead book series. And I want to thank Lien-Hang and Ariana King, I don't know if she's here, but for all of their support during the arduous revision and production process. And it's an incredible honor to for my book to be included amongst the Weatherhead book series books. So the scene in Hanoi, the Old Quarter, on the morning of September 22nd, 1932, was nothing out of the ordinary. Food vendors dished steaming bowls of noodles to customers along the sidewalk, while rickshaw drivers pulled elegantly dressed patrons in the street. Shop owners watched the goings-on while waiting for the first customer of the day. Wandering peddlers carried their heavily laden yokes while dodging pedestrians. It looked like any morning in the 36 streets. Children roamed the streets selling newspapers, their arms full of newsprint fresh from the press. Only today, they were hawking something different. A new change in the world of journalism. Buy it here. Phong Hoa, buy it here, buy it here. They cried as they walked. A Vietnamese reader, curious to see what this new change was, paid the 7 sous for the newspaper. He settles down with a cup of coffee on a sidewalk cafe and perused his new purchase. If we were to peek over his shoulder, what would we see? Scanning the broadsheet format of the paper, we would immediately be drawn first to the only picture on the page. So we have this picture here. It's a dilapidated bus full of people and belongings, stuffed absolutely full. People hanging out of the windows, even sitting on the roof and the splash guards. The title above the cartoon reads, "How We Vietnamese Conduct Business." And while a caption at the very bottom deadpans, "Strictly 25 seats." It was a scene that actually most Vietnamese people would recognize even today. Beneath the humor of this cartoon, though, lay a commentary about Vietnamese business culture. You can see that there was a blatant disregard for health and safety regulations, right? The bus is jam-packed full of people. There are bare and patched wheels. You could see that Vietnamese passengers are physically unused to traveling in a moving vehicle, illustrated in the cartoon by the vomiting passengers. The cartoon basically criticizes the slapdash, profit-motivated, lack of specialization, anything goes business habits of many Vietnamese entrepreneurs at the time. Thus, the cartoon hinted that below the paper's humor lay a reformist aim, or more generally, a social corrective. This cartoon of a dilapidated bus was the first cartoon published in the newspaper Phong Hoa, which is translated into English, is Vietnamese for mores. It was, to the best of my knowledge, the first time a humorous cartoon appeared on the front page of a newspaper. When Phong Hoa was launched in September 22nd, 1932, it became the first journal of its kind in Vietnamese history. A journal completely dedicated to humor. It was no longer banished to the margins of the newspapers as a means of filling up space left over from serious treatises. Humor was integrated front and foremost into the paper's entire ethos as a defining characteristic. Within a few months of its publication, Phong Hoa, the readership more than tripled. Within a year, its circulation passed 8,500 copies per week. While that is really modest by today's standards, this was huge at the time. At its height, Phong Hoa was one of the highest circulating Vietnamese language newspapers in Indochina at 10,000 to 12,000 issues per week. Phonghua soon became the paper of influence amongst the urban intelligentsia, not just in Tonkin in the north, but throughout the colony. It's often credited for the modernization of Vietnamese language and literature, most notably in poetry and the novel. The paper advocated the use of the vernacular Vietnamese as the language of intellectual exchange, rather than Chinese or French, and impassionedly called for aspiring writers to write in simple colloquial language free from foreign literary illusions. It spearheaded the new poetry movement. Its poets abandoned the rigid form of traditional Chinese poetry for flowing free verse, changed the subject matter from transcendental themes such as beauty and nature and virtue to more contemporary and edgier topics, such as everyday life topics such as addiction or prostitution. Vietnam's first psychological novel or interior novel, White Butterfly by Nhật Linh, was serialized in the Bay paper in 1936. In fact, the very words used today in Vietnamese to describe these various literary forms, short story, novel, drama, and author, can be traced back to its first use in Phonghua in the 1930s. In addition to such high culture literary forms, the paper was also a pioneer of mass and pop culture. It introduced crossword puzzles, color by numbers, mass market pocketbooks, spearheaded a fashion movement, and as we will see today, popularized cartoons. This newspaper and the intellectual group that produced it are the subject of my book. I explore the historical landscape of French Indochina in the 1930s. The 1930s were crucial formative years for Vietnamese nationalism and politics. It is the time when Vietnamese intellectuals forged political relationships and identities that defined the revolution to come. The self-reliant literary group, or the Lực Văn Đoàn, was arguably the most important group of intellectuals in interwar Vietnam. As the publishers of Phonghua, the group served as the vanguard of a new youthful generation of Vietnamese intellectuals born in the decade that straddled the turn of the century. This generation was the first to be educated mainly in modern French and vernacular Vietnamese, and were more or less unfamiliar with the Chinese classical worldview of their predecessors. At the heart of my project is the relationship between the intelligentsia and colonialism. I address a number of questions in my book. How did Vietnamese intellectuals make sense of the sweeping forces of modern life brought by French colonialism? How did they understand, internalize, and appropriate the foreign ideas and worldviews transmitted by their colonizers? And ultimately, how did they use this imported knowledge in their construction of a modern Vietnamese national identity? So before I know there's a number of students and grad students in the audience and today, but so I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about how I came to this topic in the first place. And actually, I like to just sort of describe it as a long process of fate, right? Or in Vietnamese, it's called duyên. I had duyên with this topic. So right after college, I went to Vietnam. It was actually the first time. I was raised in Texas, in rural Texas, to Vietnamese refugees from the war. And I had never been to Vietnam ever. I was born in the United States. And I went for the first time to Vietnam as a senior in college to Vietnam. And that's where I decided that I wanted to learn more and I wanted to go to graduate school afterwards. And so right after college, I went back to Saigon, and that's where I, took Vietnamese classes, got ready to apply for graduate school. I learned how to play the Dan Chang, the Vietnamese 16-string zither, so, taught English, supported myself for the very first time in my life, and basically had an adventure. But while I was there in my Vietnamese classes, my teacher at the University of Social Sciences and Humanities in Saigon talked a lot about, the various, literary, he introduced me to the various sort of Vietnamese authors, and and he talked about the Lic Van Daan. He's like, oh yeah, the Lic Van Daan, yeah, they're really romantic. Yeah, they're you should read them. They're really important, but they're just really, really romantic. And so I just sort of thought, okay, sure. When I arrived at grad school at University of California, Berkeley, I basically in my Vietnamese literature class was where I first read the novels of the Self-Reliant Literary Group. And that's where I found as an adult that one of the poems that I remember my own father quoting to me, one of the most vivid memories of my childhood, was of my father quoting a poem about a tiger that was sauntering through the woods, right? It was an incredible poem with really unique cadence, right? It was and I remember for the it was in this class at Berkeley where I realized that this poem that my father quoted was written by one of the members of the Self-Reliant Literary Group, right? It's the poem Nhớ Rừng by Taylor Ước, right? Ta bước chân lên dõng dạc đường hoàng, lượn tấm thân như sóng cuộn nhịp nhàng. It sort of stuck with me. And so there's sort of like a number of like moments of my life kind of came together, right? Where I realized I had Duyên with, this Self-Reliant Literary Group. And when I went to the first summer after my first year at graduate school, I went to France. And I was in the BNF, the National Library in Paris. And I was just looking around colonial newspapers, not really knowing what I was looking for, but I came across Phong Hoa and Ngày Nay. And I came across a funny cartoon, and I was kind of gripped by this like funny cartoon in the library. And it was the cartoon that I'm going to talk about today, Lý Tuét. So I wrote my first paper in grad school, like my first big research paper about this cartoon. So this is the topic that I'm sharing with you today has had any number of iterations and has evolved over the years. And then in seminar reading further on in graduate school, I read about Nhật Linh Nguyễn Tường Tam and his political career. So something didn't sit right with me. I said, how is it that this person who is supposedly a romantic in the span of about 11 years becomes the first minister of foreign affairs for an independent Vietnam? Right. So for me, something just didn't sit right. How does one go from, for example, J.K. Rowling to Hillary Clinton in about 10 years? Right. So for me, I was fascinated by this character of Nhật Linh Nguyễn Tường Tam. And so I decided to delve further. And I found that Vietnamese historiography about the Self-Reliant Literary Group only speaks about them as writers, right? Hardly, very little, at least until recently, about their politics or reform, right? These are writers, lots of secondary sources about their, literature and their novels and short stories. And even if the Vietnamese historiography does talk about their reform or their politics, it's framed as being reactionary or collaborationist, right? So these are not true revolutionaries. They did not advocate to overthrow the French. They were just merely reformists. So what I found in my own research was that in my sort of years of researching the Self-Reliant Literary Group, I found that they were more than a literary group. In fact, they were an intellectual and political group, and dare I say it, a revolutionary movement. In my book, I argued that on our own strength, that through its far-reaching political and social reforms, the Self-Reliant Literary Group developed a discernible cosmopolitanism, that is, a staunch belief in the universal liberal values and commitment to intercultural dialogue, through which it fashioned a particular vision of Vietnamese nationalism. The group re-examined every aspects of everyday Vietnamese social, political, and cultural life, and it localized global intellectual currents and practices to replace what it considered outdated Vietnamese traditions. The group proclaimed that it wanted to provide a conceptual framework or ideology for Vietnamese to traverse uncertain political and social terrain, as well as navigate structures of power and domination, in particular colonialism. As such, this framework would provide Vietnamese with guidelines to build a modern nation, no matter who was in power, thus creating a very curious and often misunderstood vision of Vietnamese nationalism that did not actively call for the overthrow of French colonialism. Because of this sort of exuberant nature of cultural borrowing, the group's cosmopolitan worldview was manifest in a number of contradictory ways, right? There's a number of ways that the group's ideas just didn't seem to jive sometimes. They embraced capitalism and bourgeois consumerism. They had a taste for literary and aesthetic modernism. There was a faith in science and technological progress, a commitment to the mastery of human nature through the manipulation of material space, and an enthusiasm for nationalism and a very complex opposition to extremist ideological politics. Citing these contradictions, people over the years, critics of the group dismissed its program as not only lacking in anti-colonial fervor, but also that it was amateurish, pastiche, and inconsistent in nature. What my book does is it reveals the internal logic of the group's worldview and how it emerged from a thorough understanding of both the Vietnamese and the global contexts. So before I continue, before I sort of highlight one particular chapter of my book, I'm just going to give a quick roadmap about where I'm going to go in today's presentation. So first, I'll give a little bit of background information and context about the self-reliant literary group, right? Where did they come from? What world did they come from? Then I will briefly touch on the sources that I used. And then after that, I'll go into the topic of humor. At the very end, I'll discuss the significance of my work and its contribution to the field of Southeast Asia and Vietnam studies and colonial history. So before I launch into more detail about my research project, I would like to give a little bit of background information, just very, very briefly, to frame this project and today's presentation. France completed its pacification of Indochina by the turn of the century, 20th century. Over the next 30 years, Vietnam underwent a period of rapid modernization that disrupted and transformed the country's economy, politics, and society. But for now, I want to highlight two of the most important transformations that are most relevant to today's discussion. The first was the metastasizing growth of Vietnamese cities from 1900s to 1930s. Hanoi, in particular, was transformed from a small ancient city to the glittering capital of a unified French Indochina. Within a few decades, the colonial government demolished the ancient citadel. It built government and civic complexes, overhauled the city's sanitation and public works infrastructure, and laid thousands of kilometers of railroads and telegraph lines that converged upon the capital. Modern technology, such as electric lights, sewage systems, automobiles, trams, and cinemas, permanently transformed the way the city looked. The introduction of market economy based on wage labor, the rule of law, and impersonal commercial exchange eroded the primacy of the village and traditional social networks. As a result of these changes, Hanoi experienced dramatic growth, its population nearly doubling between the decade between 1921 and 1931. By the 1930s, Hanoi was literally bursting at the seams. In 3 decades, the population of Hanoi tripled from around 50,000 at the turn of the century to 150,000 in 1936. It is against the backdrop of this urbanization that we begin to see the emergence of new cultural forms that reflect and appeal to this new, diverse and disparate audience of the city. The second transformation that I want to talk about is changes in education and mass literacy. This also influenced the development of both the self-reliant literary group and their Vietnamese audience. The demands of World War I on France and its colonies necessitated the training of local Vietnamese bureaucrats. In 1918, the last of Chinese language Mandarin examinations were held in Vietnam, and French authorities established the University of Hanoi. This was part of the government's new Franco-Vietnamese education system, which laid the foundation for future social change through a brand new curriculum of French language, Quốc ngữ, which is Romanized Vietnamese script, general science, hygiene, geography, and French history. So basically, this education transformation transformed the Vietnamese intelligentsia within a generation. Within a generation, Chinese ceased being the language of intellectual exchange, and it was replaced by French and vernacular Vietnamese. This linguistic disconnect created a complete shift in paradigm and worldview between the old generation of Confucian literati and the new urban intelligentsia. And who was this new urban intelligentsia, right? Who were the self-reliant literary group? They were an urbane group of intellectuals that ran the most influential commercial publishing venture in North Vietnam, Tonkin, throughout the 1930s. So just a little bit about who these guys are. The person on the upper right-hand corner, right? Upper left-hand corner, that is Nhất Linh Nguyễn Tường Tam. He's the leader of the group. He founded the group. He founded Phong Hoa, the newspaper. He actually assembled the group of writers, and he served as the newspaper's editor and chief. From this illustrious journalistic career in the 1930s, as I briefly mentioned earlier, he goes on to have an also illustrious political career in the 1940s. He would go on to revive the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, the largest non-communist nationalist party in Vietnam. He will serve as the first Minister of Foreign Affairs in an independent Vietnam. So he served under Ho Chi Minh's revolutionary government as the country's first foreign minister. He will later be outmaneuvered by the Communist Party in the late 1940s and will be branded a traitor and a counter-revolutionary, and he commits suicide in Saigon in 1963. So that's the leader. So he's joined in the venture by his two brothers, Nguyễn Tường Lân, Thạch Lam, and Nguyễn Tường Long Hoàng Đạo. These are his brothers. They are both essayists and novelists. Actually, his brother Hoàng Đạo will be his chief sort of political advisor later on. He's joined in the venture by one of his closest friends, who became the group's most prolific writer, and that is the upper right-hand corner, Khai Hưng Trần Khánh Dư, who will also be the most best-selling novelist of the group. So basically, the top four writers specialized in prose, right? Prose writing, while the bottom three were the group's new poets, right? They were the poets of the group. Tu Mỡ, from left to right, Tu Mỡ was the group's most famous satirical poets, right? So he was really famous for writing a comic a poetry column every single week called The Wayward Stream of Water, Dòng Nước Ngược. And then Nguyễn Thư Lễ Thế Lữ in the center bottom is actually one of the pioneers of the new poetry movement, as well as one of the pioneers of theater in Vietnam at the time. And then, of course, joining later on is Ngô Xuân Diệu, Xuân Diệu, who is the probably the most romantic poet, if they can be described as that, of the group. And he joined much later. But what's fascinating about this story is what happens in the post-revolutionary period. After the revolution, this group of comrades in art will become sworn political enemies, after the revolution. All of the above four all died they died early and were all persecuted by the Communist Party. All of the poets, the bottom row, on the other hand, all joined the Communist Party, denounced their activities with the group. They refashioned themselves as diehard revolutionaries, and they all lived to old age and were given a number of awards by the Communist Party. So much of the historiography, much of the way that the self-reliant literary group was written about has been shaped by this politics, right? The politics of the post-revolutionary period. The group were branded as romantics, right? As bourgeois romantics, or petit bourgeois romantics, and counter-revolutionaries. And their political careers were not really spoken of. And so, what you have in the communist historiography, that they are pretty much writers. And any mention of their politics is framed in a particular way. And actually, Fanghua Ngainai, their newspapers, are actually banned and put under restricted access in the National Library for the next few decades. Okay, so but before we sort of carry on, what I want to sort of emphasize about this intellectual milieu is that actually, even though this was a very, very small community in Hanoi, intellectual of all stripes, they all hung out together. They knew each other. They were often related to each other. They intermarried with one another. And so several of the group members taught high school with some very famous communists. For example, Vuong Nguyen Giáp and Dang Tai Mai, the communist statesman and architect of DRV education policy, they all taught at the same school as Nhật Linh and Khai Hung. So this was a very small intellectual group. And so in this world, the public was also deeply personal. About my sources, the most important primary sources for this project are the group's two newspapers. Like I said, they were held under restricted access in Vietnamese libraries until for decades. And so the newspapers are Phang Hoa, which is to the left, that's More's, and its successor publication of Ngai Nai, which is These Days. And these two newspapers spanned the years of 1932 and 1940. In addition, I look at other colonial newspapers of the time, and I consulted about over 75 titles of other newspapers to see how the group's ideas were debated in the colonial press at the time. I also use archival documents from 3 different archives in Vietnam and 2 in France. And finally, I have been very, very fortunate to be able to interview family members and descendants of the self-reliant literary group living in the United States, in France, and in Vietnam. So what I want to do now, now that I sort of have laid out a sort of general overview of the book itself, what I want to do is to sort of focus on what I think is a sexy chapter of, my book. And this is the chapter focusing on cartoons and humor. And the larger project, the overall project, looks at, topics such as fashion, public housing, literature, women's issues. What I want to do is to focus the rest of today's presentation on humor, because it's the main foundation of the group's journalistic activities and the mode of transmission for its overall message. I argue that the group's humor did not merely serve as an instrument towards social reform, but that it involved an entirely new way of seeing and being that was thoroughly modern. So a little bit about the newspaper's humor. For Phang Hoa, laughter is not a simple act, right? It's not it's not just about relieving, some kind of pent-up pressure. Instead, it's actually an act that is wrapped up in the drama of the human condition. It was not just something pleasurable or recreational, but it is one that carried great potential as a social corrective. The paper used use irony and humor widespread, and forces the reader to basically take everything in the paper with a sense of skepticism, the kind when combined with suspicion of authority and doubt of absolutes, define a kind of modern sensibility. For the first time, readers are no longer passive vessels or students to the authority of pedantic newspapers. Instead, they are active readers and participants. In short, Fanghua invited its audience to intellectual independence. But the largest and most prominent trope of Fanghua's humor is a visual and textual character. This is a country bumpkin by the name of Li Tuet. He's a fictitious character that appeared in short stories, articles, poems, advertisements, and essays. His presence in the newspaper was ubiquitous, and it was indicative of Fanghua's overarching ethos of humor. And basically the character itself becomes the sort of cultural icon of the decade. And then amongst a particular generation of Vietnamese, they still talk about, referring to somebody as a Li Tuet or a Sasse. This is how kind of ingrained it's become in kind of Vietnamese like cultural consciousness. So what I want to do now is just to kind of show you a few cartoons from the Li Tuet cartoons, and there's a theme that emerges here, and so I just want to sort of throw up a few to illustrate. So this is a cartoon of Li Tuet in a shop. He's with his son. You can see that they are very slovenly dressed. They definitely look like country bumpkins. But he's in a fancy shop buying an umbrella, and he's telling the shop lady if he asks her if she could please wrap up his umbrella because it's raining so hard outside that he doesn't want it to get wet. So yes, he's doesn't get the what it's used for. And this second cartoon is this is Li Tuet in the city. Actually, this is the very first cartoon that ever appears of, this is his first appearance in Fanghua in May of 1933. This is him in the city. And he goes to the city and he sees a water fountain and comments, "What a strange tombstone it is." So not really understanding modern, I guess, infrastructure. Here's another one, again, keeping up with the theme. This is him again in the city, and he holds his nose and he comments above an open manhole into the sewer that he says that, they say that people in Hanoi are really, really civilized. The well in my village is pretty dirty, but it's not as dirty as this well. So doesn't really understand that actually one of the greatest marvels of modern technology and modern engineering is the ability to flush a toilet, right? I mean, all sorts of like hygiene and public health issues were solved with that one invention, right? He doesn't understand that. So that's him. Here he is at a boxing match. And he, again, variations on a theme, right? He's at a boxing match and he's yelling to the boxers, stop, let's not fight amongst each other. We should make peace, right? Not really understanding that, that there is such thing as recreational fighting. And this is actually my personal favorite. This is Li Tuet. He, again, in the city with his sidekick, right? So his sidekick is a fat country, a fat village mayor by the name of Sasse. And they're in a movie theater, and Sasse says to his sidekick, what are they doing, right? There's a couple like, passionately kissing on the screen. What are they doing? And Li Tuet says, they're feeding each other rice. That's what they're doing. He's thinking that they are doing the practice that is often common in the countryside, in which a mother pre-chews her food and spits it into her child's mouth, practice called pre-mastication. So that's what he thinks that they are doing. So not familiar with the topic of romantic love, as well as the idea of French kissing, right? Or mouth-to-mouth kissing. It's a strange thing for him. Okay, and then here's another one. This is Lithuet. Actually, this is the first cartoon featuring Lithuet and Sase. And you can see here that these are visual kind of cognates of Laurel and Hardy, right? And so Lithuet is the skinny one, Sase is the fat one. And this is the very first one that features the two of them. And they look at a scale and they say, okay, the sign says it costs 1 sou for them to weigh themselves. And they said, well, they only have 1 sou between the two of them. So what are they going to do? They are going to weigh themselves together and divide the number in half, which that's not how that works. But as you can see, there's a theme that emerges from these cartoons. The theme is that that Vietnamese country bumpkins don't understand modern life, right? And this becomes a kind of this becomes a kind of metaphor for the country itself in many ways. And actually, some have argued that this is a way for, kind of sophisticated Vietnamese to laugh at their less civilized or less sophisticated compatriots. But that said, I think that there should be a more complex way of reading it. Because if you can see here, these are cartoons because of the various quality of the drawings and the different signatures of those who contributed. This was actually contributed by the readership, right? So Vietnamese readers loved this trope of country bumpkin in the city, sending these cartoons in, and they were published in the newspaper, right? So you can see the varying qualities of these. So this became a kind of, similar to a meme, right? That Vietnamese readers were participating in. But that said, the group tried to steer the conversation about Lithuet in their own way. And actually, this is really important to understand, is that the readership loved the kind of like Dumb and Dumber approach, but the group had a very different approach to this discourse. So for the group, they loved, rather than featuring him, Lithuet, with a sidekick that was also dumb and stupid as he was, the group's contributions featured Lithuet talking to another sidekick by the name of Baruch. And if you see here, Baruch is the visual opposite of Lithuet, right? So he's a prankster, he's urbane, he wears a 3-piece suit, often wears a fedora. He's a kind of city slicker. He's stylish, he's basically at home in Hanoi, and in many ways represents the self-reliant literary group himself, right? So he exemplified the youthful attitudes of the self-reliant literary group, and can be seen as their visual representative. And the items that feature Lithuet with this sidekick, with Baruch, took the form of random conversations called meandering stories, or go to Lang Quang. These stories never really had a point to them. They were just merely kind of vignettes of conversations between two drinking buddies. I don't want to go too much into detail, but the conversations would feature Baruch talking to Lithuet about topics as far and wide as the difference between Nazi brown shirts and Italian black shirts. They would talk about French literature, the League of Nations, right? But Lithuet, in his kind of country bumpkin way, would understand these ideas in his sort of limited way, and offers responses based on his kind of limited worldview. And on one level, you can kind of read these stories as a way to explain current events as well as allow the group to express their political opinions. But actually, on another level, if you take it to a different level, the fictional conversation between these two sidekicks, right, between Baek and Litwet, reveals a lot about the way that the group envisioned the relationship between tradition and modernity, right? So obviously, Litwet is the stand-in for tradition. Baek is the representative of modernity. They don't argue violently, right? They don't kind of have massive like busts up with one another. They don't shut each other out. Baek's large cosmopolitan worldview allows him to speak casually about German, European politics, while Litwet's parochial small view, is limited to sort of superstition and village rituals, right? But you don't get one trying to impose their visions on the other. In fact, it was a conversation between equals. And what's more, the conversations are meandering, right? Go to it and Lien-Hang. They don't have beginnings, they don't have endings. There's no consensus, no disagreement. There's no morality to any of this. It reflects the messy and often mundane nature of the encounter between tradition and modernity. But that said, despite the massive cultural gulf between the two of them, they all exhibit mutual sympathy and even patience to one another. And here we see a split between the self-reliant literary group and its readers. The readers loved the sidekick of Sase more, right? They love the dumber and dumb, the dumb and dumber shtick, whereas the self-reliant literary group loved the Baek sidekick. And the readers also loved the whole idea of creating memes about replicating the same tropes, whereas the group preferred to write, right, more prose, more textual items. So basically what this, I guess, conflict suggests is that although the self-reliant literary group may have wanted to guide the discourse, the country bumpkin basically remained the domain of the readers. So the mutual affection between Litwet and Baek also reflects conflicting impulses within the group's own intellectual reform project, right? The group basically, advocated modernization, but at the same time showed a kind of sympathy to the plight of the peasantry. But at the end of the day, what emerges from this is a kind of gulf, right? That one between the group and its own readers. What is so important about this engagement, right? About this tension between the group and its own readers, and the fact that there is a dialogue between the group and its own readers. What's revealing about studying this newspaper is that in doing so, we get a rare glimpse into the active creation of civil society through the public sphere, guided by the dreams and vision of a select group of elites. Because this paper was so interactive, and because the readers themselves, as we saw in the case of humor, made a lot of contribution to the paper, we can see that over the course of the 1930s, right, through these cartoons, how the group and the Vietnamese reading public came to understand together what it meant to be modern and to be Vietnamese. As I've shown in this talk, the readers were not always willing, however, to adopt this perspective that the group hoped they would. This suggests that the group's project was in many ways too avant-garde for the readership. The readers were not necessarily ready to embrace the group's uncompromising modernist vision. On the other hand, the group hoped to bring about independence of mind but were not always entirely comfortable to let the readers create that vision for themselves. Ultimately, it was about this frustration, about the ambiguity and the flux of modern life that led some members of the group to ally themselves with the Communist project and its demands for the immediate creation of a Vietnamese state that could more directly oversee the education of Vietnamese citizens and the nation building process. Communism did not allow for the ambiguity and the skepticism called for by the group. Rather, it had a dictated outcome and had a single truth for what it meant to be modern and to be Vietnamese. Before I end my talk today, I wanted to talk a little, just talk about the contributions that this work makes to Vietnamese history, European imperialism, Southeast Asian history, and to the various fields that I dialogue with. I make two distinct contributions. First, it offers a substantial intervention into the scholarship of colonial Vietnam. Nationalist histories implicitly depict the victory of Marxism-Leninism as a foregone conclusion, not only reducing the importance of other revolutionary initiatives, but also flattens the rich intellectual and cultural context that gave birth to Vietnamese nationalism. Although critical of the communist narrative, Western language scholarship in many ways still unwittingly replicates these distorted characterizations. My book argues, in contrast, that the presence of strong nationalist movements like the Self-Reliant Literary Group necessarily shaped the way that that the Indo-Chinese Communist Party positioned itself for mass support in the years leading up to the revolution. Thus, one cannot understand the evolution of the Communist Party with writ small and the trajectory of 20th century Vietnamese history writ large without understanding the Self-Reliant Literary Group and its role in the vibrant interwar context. My second contribution is that it addresses the larger field of European imperialism and empire by highlighting a case study of nationalism in which anti-colonialism was largely absent. The group's vision emerged from the tumultuous interwar era in dialogue with French intellectual traditions, as well as global trends in art, thought, and culture, all against the backdrop of the colonial experience. By contextualizing the group's intellectual project within this larger global milieu, my book reveals that Vietnamese intellectuals realize that they can only depend on themselves in the face of economic and political uncertainty, hence self-reliance. The group's belief in self-reliance came to encompass a kind of do-it-yourself nationalism in which Vietnamese could transform themselves and build a nation from the ground up, independent of the capricious whims of the colonial state and whoever was in power at the time for that matter. In analyzing the group's unique response to the world around it, my book challenges prevailing assumptions that nationalism and anti-colonialism are inseparable and that the nation state was the necessary end form of patriotism. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll take some questions. Okay. Okay.
We have about 30 minutes. So now we'll just follow up with commentaries when we'll start with Dr. Claire Edington. Is that okay?
So I'm speaking more generally. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for hosting us today and for hosting this really exciting conversation. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. So I really appreciate the opportunity today to think very capaciously about intellectual history beyond just thinking about it as a history of concepts or ideas, but also thinking about the movement of concepts across languages, cultures, and geographies, and to proliferate the sites of where we locate intellectual history. And that's one of the things I appreciate the most, I think, about Martina's work, is that she's looking at the development of this cosmopolitan nationalism within a global context, while also looking at the highly localized ways in which it was expressed and deployed, and also very kind of surprising venues. She takes us to thinking about like fashion and humor, for instance. And it's not lost on me either that this framing of tension in the work of the Self-Reliant Literary Group, this tension between modernity and tradition, is being expressed in terms of the confusion or misrecognition of everyday scientific technologies. So one of the things that's most kind of exciting and interesting for me is to contemplate bringing together intellectual history with histories of science. Historians of science have, especially in colonial and post-colonial contexts, have been long interested in how scientific ideas travel across contexts, how they're transformed as a result of these kinds of exchanges that are happening between kind of global and local experts. And they've really done a really, I think, important job of foregrounding Indigenous agency in terms of the selective appropriation, accommodation, or discarding of these kind of global concepts to meet kind of the needs of kind of local contexts. So I'm thinking here about the work of Colombia's Marwa El-Shakri on reading Darwin in Arabic, Projit Mukherjee's work on Ayurvedic medicine and everyday technologies, as well as Ari Heinrich's work on 19th century Chinese medical portraiture, and the transmission of ideas about pathology and about culture through this creation of a new kind of visual idiom in China in the 19th century. And in my own work, I'm really interested in exploring how ideas about mental illness and also about drug addiction, how those travel, not just between France and Vietnam, but also regionally within Southeast Asia. And to think a little bit too, in terms of how a lot of these conversations are not just about kind of scientific concepts or ideas or practices, but really what's at stake are broader ideas about racial difference, about civilization, about modernity, and about progress. I think one of the things that history of science can potentially offer intellectual history of Vietnam is kind of shifting the focus from thinking discursively to kind of more materially, the impact that these conversations have on people's experiences of their bodies, and how they contribute to kind of policies and new kinds of legal regimes, medical regimes, which seek to kind of discipline and control and police the movements of bodies throughout colonial space. I think one of the other things history of science can offer is thinking a little bit beyond kind of elite intellectuals or even experts to the role that kind of lay people, everyday readers play in thinking about the creation of these new kinds of intellectual communities and as sites of themselves of knowledge production. Knowledge doesn't just happen in schools, in institutions, and elite policy circles. And I think Martina's work also reminds us of these like really dynamic new public spaces in which these ideas are being debated. And so I think I'll end here and hand things over to Steve.
So I have some comments and questions specifically about Martina's work. I don't know if I should sort of go into that or just kind of speak generally about the question of intellectual history. Okay. All right. Yeah. All right. So I'll have some questions for you and I'll let you respond and I'll go. Okay. Okay. So I thought it was really interesting sort of going into the politics of the Diluk Bangduang through their idea of humor or satire, right? Because I think their concept of satire really embodies the kind of reformist politics that they had, insofar as let me see, it's like the cartoons kind of underscore underdevelopment though, and the need for progress, right? There's a famous essay by Phan Khoi, who was kind of a fellow traveler to the Diluk Bangduang, talking about the differences between civilized humor and uncivilized humor. And he, in that piece, is kind of criticizing the Vietnamese for sort of laughing at people's misfortunes. Like, I guess during that period when people would fall down and hurt themselves, Vietnamese people would just start laughing at them. And so he makes a statement in the essay saying that if you go to France, right, when someone falls down and breaks their leg, though, people don't laugh. They're very civilized there. They laugh at, they laugh in this sort of democratic way in order to, this sort of, the call attention to inequality and that sort of thing, not just to sort of make fun of other people. So I'm wondering, okay, so in it seems like the Diluk Bangduang explicitly identify their concept of humor with the West, just as they identify the concept of progress and modernity with the West. And I'm wondering, to what degree do you think that opens them to the kind of standard post-colonial critique, right? That their concept of modernity is one that sort of simply accepts the West as being sort of the model of all that is modern. So.
I would actually say that the group, in many ways, they definitely identify themselves with sort of the modern West. But I think that in their nationalism and in their building of a Vietnamese, like a modern Vietnamese national identity, they don't actually just piecemeal take everything from the West and just sort of plunk it in kind of like a Vietnamese space. For them, it's about borrowing things, absolutely, but borrowing things thoughtfully, borrowing things that would that make sense for a Vietnamese context. So I actually think that despite the fact that they are very much kind of often seen as kind of these like uber Europeanists. I mean, if you read Vũ Trọng Phụng,'s, Soda or Dumb Luck, these guys are seen as like, unabashed, unapologetic Europeanizers. But actually the case is they were much more thoughtful than that. In the Self-Reliant Literary Group's manifesto, they basically said to write about the Vietnamese experience using the Vietnamese language without foreign literary illusions, right? So there's an attempt here at a creation of a space that is Vietnamese, and of course, not saying that we're not borrowing from other, this is their cosmopolitanism here, but doing so in a way that makes sure that it fits with the Vietnamese context. So I would sort of preface it with or at least say it in that regard, because the characterization of the group as being just Europeanists is one that's leveled against them by Vũ Trọng Phụng and then later on by the Communist Party, right? And but they were actually much more sort of thoughtful and a lot more sort of conscientious about what is being borrowed.
And then the second question that I had was, so it seems undoubtedly the case that communist historiography has tried very hard to minimize the appeal of the Tuluk Bangduang's politics, right? But I'm wondering about the group's sort of larger and more lasting impact, given that in the South, for example, during the Tuluk Bangduang still had this stature as being this kind of national cultural movement, right, which no other sort of group could compete with in the South. And Nhật Linh maintained his stature as being this important intellectual, but they also looked at him as being sort of outdated too. So Va Phien, for example, describes all of this kind of esteem that younger writers gave him, but at the same time sort of viewed his works as no longer being relevant to the political, the current situation. So I wonder what you would say about that. So there's no doubt that the communist historiography has minimized the politics, but then you have this sort of counterexample of the South there where that politics didn't seem to have as broad of an appeal possibly, right?
Yeah, but then there was also, in the South for sure. I mean, and of course, when Nhật Linh re-emerges in the South in the 1960s, he is like kind of like the grandfatherly figure, right? He's like this older figure. There's these young whippersnappers trying to do these new things with literature. He tries to revive his after this, like his political career collapses. He comes back to Saigon and tries to reestablish his journalistic career and literary career. And he starts a newspaper, a journal called Văn Hóa Ngày Nay, that sort of tries to kind of, bring back the sort of ethos. And it doesn't really work, right? It seems kind of outdated. But that said, there was also a movement in the South that called themselves the Tân Tự Lực Văn Đoàn. So there's this movement of like kind of young literary writers that were, if they weren't trying to copy the sort of form of the, but at least, somehow replicate the same kind of like avant-garde spirit of it. So in many ways, like, yeah, the group itself was outdated in the South by the 1960s. But that said, there were still people kind of, there was a kind of, I guess, undercurrent about it. And of course, now in Vietnam, I actually think that their popularity seems to kind of coincide with periods of like greater Vietnamese integration into the global world, right, into the global market. And so now the Luc Van Doan, the ancestral seat of the Nguyen Tuong family, right, Nhất Linh Thạch Lam, in Cẩm Giang province in Hải Dương. That's now a kind of like pilgrimage site. They have like the Luc Van Doan pilgrimages and the Luc Van Doan conferences and things like that there. And so I mean, I think, if you look at it in sort of a more sort of longue durée, the group actually has sort of periods of, kind of decline in popularity, but then also increase in popularity. I mean, in the past kind of 10 years, we have 5 books published on Tự Lực Văn Đoàn. So in the sort of past kind of few years, there is a new revived interest in the group and what they mean. And especially, like last year, there was a book out called, the Vấn đề phụ nữ, trong báo chí Tự Lực Văn Đoàn. Like there's like all these new kind of scholarly interest, right, in the group. So yeah, I would say yes, in the 60s, a lack of popularity, but they're back.
Sure. Okay. So I wasn't trained in intellectual history, and I didn't consciously set out to write any intellectual histories. I sort of stumbled into the field in the course of exploring certain historical questions that I had. So I can't give a definitive account of what intellectual history, Vietnamese or otherwise, is. But I can talk about problems that I've encountered in the course of my research on Vietnam that may have some methodological significance with regard to intellectual history. The first problem that I want to discuss is the problem that that I think usually in writing intellectual histories, it's impossible to simply identify an important idea and then just kind of trace how it gradually spreads in this linear fashion and then gets developed, right? And there's a lot of reasons for this. And there's 2 that I want to mention in particular. One dealing with intellectual history in general, and the second dealing with Vietnamese intellectual history in particular. So the first relates to the difficulty or the complexity of ideas, right? So I have a lot of work in critical theory, and I write on a number of thinkers that I consider to be difficult, including Karl Marx. And what you find when you look at the influence of thinkers like Marx is not this sort of gradual process of appropriation and the development of their ideas by subsequent thinkers who adapt their ideas in new historical circumstances, right? I mean, this is often how the story is told, right? If you read, for example, the Italian autonomy school of Marxism, they usually tell the story about how Marx wrote during the Industrial Revolution in England. He was limited by his historical circumstances and therefore couldn't write about kind of immaterial forms of labor that predominate today, right? I think what has happened instead, though, is what you see is a kind of long series of more or less consequential misinterpretations of important writers, right? So in the case of Marx, right, there'll be some kind of intellectual fashion change, right? That makes a text like Capital suddenly impossible to read, right? So suddenly no one reads Hegel anymore. And, this complicated, like Hegelian method that Marx critically appropriates, though, is no longer legible, right? And so instead of seeing this kind of straight line, right, where ideas kind of spread gradually, what you see is sort of these situations where, so I think intellectual history, as I understand it, right, does not examine how ideas gradually spread in this continuous fashion, but instead looks at sort of discontinuities in an apparently linear story of the spread of ideas, right? It looks for moments when important ideas suddenly become unintelligible, right? Or when a new political or intellectual regime emerges and kind of wipes out the history that came before it or imposes retroactively, right, its own image of the past. So that's what I'd say about intellectual history in general. And then I think the second reason that intellectual history should not be understood as a linear spread of ideas is because of the materialist insight, right, that there really is no independent history of ideas separate from the social, economic, institutional, and political conditions that determine the production, the circulation, the reception, and the transmission of ideas, right? And I think this is especially the case with Vietnamese history, where the transmission of ideas has been continually disrupted by colonialism and war, right? So for example, the introduction of the colonial education system and the Romanized script, which overlapped with and then kind of replaced the imperial system of civil examinations. This, right, as Benedict Anderson and a lot of other scholars have described, right, the shift amounted to a wholesale transformation of the very system of political and cultural reproduction, right? And it was a transformation that made writings and ideas of earlier generations of Vietnamese inaccessible to later ones, while at the same time opening up all of these new social and political possibilities for mobilization, right? So yes, I'll just stop with that. So oftentimes what you see is not a straight line, but instead sort of a new regime emerging and kind of like retroactively rewriting what came before it.
Thanks so much for your comments and these reflections. And I agree that when we think about establishing another subdiscipline, there's possibilities, but there's also these limitations, these new problems, these new questions we have to think about. But on the flip side of that, or to complement that, and to add on to what I was talking about in the remarks about not thinking about an intellectual that's in an intellectual history that's far removed or distant from the masses, is to think about this interaction between these subdisciplines. And I would say that one major distinction among the different subdisciplines of history are the people involved. Are they the underdogs, or are they the political actors? Are they the president, or these political figures? And that determines if it's a social history, or maybe it's a political history or diplomatic history. And so in each of your work, though, I would say that you challenge that in different ways. The self-reliant literary group and them being political agents themselves, or how the marginalized are playing important roles in knowledge production around medicine and ideas of medicine, and how the Knoll brothers' ideological vision was rooted in this intellectual philosophy. So how would you say that what do you think this tells us about Vietnam and its capacity to inform the way that we might examine history and intellectual history more specifically? Yeah, I'll leave it there. And I also just want to say that if you have any questions, we'll be following up with questions afterwards. So I'll have the panelists answer this first question, and then we'll field a question in the room and then a question online.
Oh, me? Oh, okay. You forgot cultural history. I actually I was sort of trained in this at the height of cultural history, and actually in many ways I consider myself a cultural historian. But that said, I mean, Vietnam, to do Vietnamese history, I mean, okay, so I guess what's the difference between intellectual history and cultural history, right? I mean, are they one and the same? What's the difference? And I think there's a sort of different method or approach to these two different types of histories. I think intellectual history, would think about a system of ideas, as a sort of contained system, right? So, for example, Marxism, right? So an intellectual historian would start with culture, orthodox Marxism, and then think about the various thinkers over time that have contributed to the transformation of Marxism, like Edward Bernstein, Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, and then Mao, and talk about the transformation of Marxism over time, and that's what the sort of intellectual history is like. Well, yeah. I think cultural historians, what they do is they actually take a group of ideas once it hits the realm of public discourse, right? So when it becomes culture, right? So in the case of Marxism, cultural historians would be interested in how like Vietnamese peasants think about it, or Marx, studies of like Marxist propaganda, for example, like when Marxism becomes I mean, this is the kind of stuff that Marx famously said, like if this is Marxism, I'm not a Marxist, right? But this is what I think of as, cultural history. And I think what's unique about Vietnamese history and what Vietnam allows us to do is a little bit of both. Because Vietnamese history is such a relatively young field, there isn't the kind of heft of historiography behind it. Right. So for example, if you're going to introduce, how the ideas of Phạm Quỳnh or Nguyễn Văn Vĩnh was taken by the Vietnamese public, you're actually going to have to do some of the intellectual history work. Like, what did he actually think, or what did they actually think? You have to define, you're kind of in many ways in Vietnamese history reinventing the wheel. Right. So you have to kind of do the intellectual history, and then you could do the kind of cultural history around it. So I think actually that's where Vietnam provides for, at least for historians and scholars, a really kind of like, I guess, unbroken ground in that regard.
So in response to Ian's question about looking at history from the perspective of marginalized viewpoints, there's one thing that's kind of lurking in the background of my book that I wasn't fully able to kind of make explicit. And I think that there's a lack of attention, or there's been a lack of attention to the impact of the introduction of different media systems in Vietnamese histories, right? So we talk about sort of ideas and the impact they have, people understanding these ideas, but these ideas have to kind of go through this new system of print capitalism that was introduced in Vietnam. And a lot of political leaders realize this. So for example, the Ngo brothers during the Vietnam War paid a lot of attention to sort of trying to sort of get print media into the countryside, because it was so difficult in the context of the war to have this stuff disseminated, because they knew that it was kind of an important kind of bond tying the countryside with the cities and so forth. And but I think the other impact here was, they had with their personalism, which was the official political philosophy of the First Republic of Vietnam, a pretty complicated political philosophy, pretty complicated philosophical system. And what they didn't understand, I think, perhaps, was that this complicated philosophical system was not appropriate for the kind of mass media system that was emerging during that period. It worked much better to say that this war was about the communists versus sort of people that believed in nationalism and democracy, because it's a very simple message to get across. If you want to say that, we believe in a form of Marxist humanist, anti-capitalist ideology that is against the Communist Party, it's something that might not work very well in that medium. So that's something I think should be paid more attention to when people do the history of ideas. They look at how ideas are invented, how they're disseminated. But it's not enough, I think, to explicate what those ideas are. You actually have to look at how they interact with these new media systems that come into play, and sort of how they work or don't work very well with those new media systems.
Let's see. I mean, I guess like your question is kind of perhaps trying to get us to think about how intellectual history allows several subdisciplines within Vietnamese history to be more in conversation with each other. Is that partly what you're thinking? Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that feels exciting for me is I feel like a lot of Vietnamese history, we tend to be pretty siloed. Not just in terms of intellectual versus political versus cultural history, but in terms of which languages we work with. Thinking also about periodization. There's not a lot of work that span, for instance, the colonial or post-colonial period. So I think there is, and I think that is changing, but I think intellectual history in this more kind of reimagined, capacious view would allow us to track these more kind of long-term changes in your own work across the 20th century. Thinking about how languages of freedom became reimagined at different political moments, I think is one kind of really important example of what intellectual history could offer, like the future directions of Vietnamese studies.
So are there any questions in the audience? Yeah, we'll start with David. Do you, wait, David. Oh, yeah, here we go. Sorry.
Hey, awesome talk. I like the part about the sidekicks. I thought that was really illuminating. I was just kind of curious, flipping through the book, in the different tenets of the self-reliant literary group, they were pretty explicit about saying they were willing to be selective about Europe and French texts, but they were very much against taking anything from China. They were very much about like, we need to get rid of Chinese characters. How much do you view this period as being, what extent do you feel that there is some implicit influence from China, and how can that be tied into the different ideas of rejection of the past, of the countryside, of things such as the Confucian exams? How much do we have to frame this in the view of, say, Chinese colonialism versus something like Western colonialism?
Yeah, I actually think that the group's rejection of sort of, I argue this in the book, is that a lot of scholars have talked about, oh, you know, they rejected Confucianism and they championed individual freedom and the ideas of romantic love, and but actually, and they challenged and fought against the ideas of the family, right? Of the and a lot of the, citing famous books by the group, Doa and Tuet and whatever, and the sort of like, the very, very kind of like stronghold of the family and the Confucian family over Vietnamese society. And actually, what I argue in the book is that it's not just a cultural strength. I mean, for them, it's an economic system, right? And so for the group, this, this like willing, there is no doubt that in their minds, the future is Europe, right? That Vietnamese salvation, it comes from the adaptation of ideas from Europe, and that, it's possible that they've constructed some vision of sort of long-term Chinese colonialism, and but for them, they were actually operating on much more kind of, I guess, immediate concerns, that the stranglehold of the family is not just a cultural institution; it is an economic system, right? And so if you so if you think about it in those terms, that their social reform project makes more sense, right? It's seen as much more radical, right, than just they wanted people to marry whoever they wanted. Well, no, it's because if you think about it, the family is the way that Confucian society structures the state on down to the individual family, and of course economics and the economics of the state and society. And so I think for them it's less a thinking about working against a sort of Chinese imperialism, but it's basically what they saw as the more immediate influence of in particular Confucianism on what they were trying to do on transforming Vietnamese society. If that,
Hi. So I'm a history student, and I'm very interested in I really like your discussion about like the intersection between intellectual and cultural history. I'm personally more interested in like the intersection between like intellectual and political history. But I guess like this talk and this topic is very interesting for me because I was educated for like 12 years in the public schools in Vietnam, and so I learned a lot about like the like kind of the historiography of Tự lực Văn Đoàn and like Vietnamese literature. And I remember that like back in high school, I was taught that even within Tự lực Văn Đoàn, there's a group like there's a division between like the idealists, like the humanists, of Nhật Linh, and there's another of the realists, of those who are like more of those whose work could be identified as like in a more Marxist way.
socialist realism.
Yes, exactly. So I was just wondering, like, how, like, in terms of what you're arguing and your narrative in this book, how do you think it's like, how do you think it's contributing to the conversation between in Tự lực Văn Đoàn, about Tự lực Văn Đoàn, and how do you think that is it's like kind of conversing with like what the communist historiography is trying to push about the group.
Yeah, so it actually sort of at least I hope revise it all together, right? But basically the way that Vietnamese historiography about the Luc Van Doan has emerged is that because there's such an overemphasis on the group's literature, right? Short stories, their novels, right? Like, if you go into any sort of Vietnamese library, Vietnamese bookstore, there's 10, 20 different analysis of like Hồn Bướm Mơ Tiên and Đoạn Tuyệt today. But basically what they have done is taken the novels out of the newspapers, right? Because the Luc Van Doan, when they published, they didn't publish they published the novels as novels separately. That's afterwards. When they originally published the novels, they were serialized, right, as a feuilleton in Phong Hoa and Ngày Nay. So you need to put those novels back into the newspaper and read that all together as a coherent body of scholarship. If you take out if you just look at Hồn Bướm Mơ Tiên, sure, it's romantic. Sure, it's like, all about personal freedom. But if you read it side by side with Lý Tuét, you read it side by side with Hoàng Đạo writing about, công dân giáo dục, for example, and you write about, and you read it simultaneously with the group's criticisms of colonialism, all of that becomes a much more expansive intellectual project and it becomes more radical, right? It becomes more radical. The whole idea of like the Luc Van Doan as bourgeois romantics, yeah, you're only reading the novels. But if you read the newspapers, which have been banned and put under, restrictive access at, the Thư viện Quốc gia for decades, you actually, a different view, a much more comprehensive view of the group emerges. And they are much more radical and they are much more politically engaged than people would ever think. Like these guys didn't just write about people marrying who they want and, like all this like reformist stuff. They also wrote about politics. These guys, were not, how should we say it? They were not like phản cách mạng in many ways, right? Like they actually, in many ways, they're much more radical than they were given credit for. In fact, I actually argue in my book that they adopt the politics of the center left. They were mainstream socialists in the way that, they were not radical communists, but they weren't these like, right wingers, in the way that the communist historiography, they're actually much more progressive. They're what we call social democrats.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So one last question, and then I can walk through.
Oh, hi. Thank you for your talk. I was wondering how you would characterize the Luc Van Doan's judgment and opinion of their female colleagues that were also in print culture, such as Nguyễn Đức Nhuận.
Yeah.
And
Madame Nguyễn Đức Nhuận.
and Man Man in Phụ Nữ Thăng Văn.
Okay.
Collecting all the questions.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, we're doing.
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. We collect first, and then
Okay. Okay.
and hope you will not forget the questions.
No, I won't. Yeah. I'm writing.
First of all, I would like to thank you, Martina, for very interesting presentation. Even I came from Vietnam, but the Luc Van Doan was not teaching in my age, in my time, so not so much. So my two questions are: number one, can you explain why the Luc Van Doan exist in this time in north of Vietnam, not in the south? Because the first newspaper in Vietnam came from Gia Định, in 19th century. And I hope that, Saigon must be a center of, civilization, colony. But here come from Cẩm Giàng, you see, this is very northern, very villages, I mean Delta, Red River, and what can explain this emergence of the Luc Van Doan there? And the second, I think the question is, it's if you say that it is anti-colonialism, we can say that's a movement or some kind of thing. Then was there connection between anti-colonialism movement, recommend Phan Bội Châu or Phan Chu Trinh at this time, right? Okay, Phan Bội Châu started the Đông Du movement in 1907, and Phan Chu Trinh almost the same time. Are there some were there some connection between them if they share the same attitude to anti-colonialism and modernization or not? Or do they know each other? Did they have any connection or not? Thank you.
So just to tie this back into like today's world, I have a question written down. So you've highlighted Fang Hua's initiative in leading social reform through literary engagement of these themes that connected modernity and traditionalism. Do you think that, do you see any like groups like that try to achieve progress by appealing and appealing to and involving more everyday types into political society, political activist society? Or do you think that we kind of like lack the cultural cohesion that Vietnam kind of sorry.
Okay. So should I answer sort of, or are there more questions or?
So since we're kind of ending the formal part, please stay if you can. If not, thank you so much for attending, and we'll do a quick clap of applause for everyone here to hear their answers.
Thank you.
And we'll collect the online questions.
Yeah,
and we will ask.
Online question.
Yeah. Okay.
Do we ask that now, or those are a lot of questions. Maybe we should.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So about the first question about the Van Duan and their female counterparts, right? The other female intellectuals at the time. Actually, Phong Hoa and Ngai Nai featured female contributors. There were women who write. There was a woman named Cô Duyên who wrote the women's column for a number of months in Phong Hoa or in Ngai Nai, excuse me. So there were any number of sort of female collaborators, but I actually think that this is where you can see the limitations of the Luc Van Duan's political project. If you look at the way that they sort of the attitudes that they had towards women, right? If you look at in particular, I talk about Lemur Nguyen Cat Tuong and his design of the Vietnamese áo dài, right? The áo Lemur, which was the beginnings of the Vietnamese áo dài, the national costume in Phong Hoa. They take a very sort of patriarchal view of women, in the sense that women, that they're telling women what to do, right? It's basically Luc Van Duan telling women how to dress, how their bodies should look like, but then using that as a way of saying, no, but we're doing this to emancipate you, right? We're doing this as a way for you to become part of the modern world, but not to self-actualize in, to become, the best version that you want to be. It's so that you can become the modern mother and the modern wife to the modern man, right? So I think that this is where the Luc Van Duan's, vision, it's limited. Now, personally, about their views of Madame Nguyễn Đức Nhuận or any of the other female, individually, they always speak of them very, very, kind of praisingly, right? They don't go into the same kind of, pen wars with female interlocutors as they did with, I don't know, Trương Tử, right? Or Nguyễn Công Hoan, for example. They were actually very, and whether or not that is actually kind of condescending behavior because they're not even engaging with them, that's another way of thinking about it. But they always speak about these particular, female intellectual figures quite, as opposed to, another colonial newspaper called Việt Đức, that was actually very disparaging of female intellectuals, right? Yeah, so yeah.
I want to add that in the commentary on like the whole year of Nữ in the South, they did say that the modern women who were their colleagues in Britain should go and wait for a man to come and purchase them as slaves. So it's not always so crazy.
No. I think their gender discussions need to be looked at much more closely. Yeah, for sure. And then this is our second question. This is thầy Phạm Quang Minh question on why did the Lực Văn Đoàn emerge in North Vietnam and why, right? I mean, there's a sort of longue durée question of, actually there's such a rich literary tradition that's northern, right? I mean, especially, but then I actually would say that for me, the reason why the Lực Văn Đoàn emerges in the North is actually less of a longue durée rationale than more immediate, right? It's the colonial experience, right? The political colonial experience of the North versus the South. The South was a full colony, right? The people in the South enjoyed much more freedom of the press, freedom of expression. Southerners were allowed to become citizens. The North was a protectorate, right? So it was technically under the marginal rule of the emperor, but then it was, there was a résidence supérieure who sort of runs things, and it's this kind of halfway between, and so I think the Lực Văn Đoàn, and it had limited freedom of expression, limited, there was a lot more censorship in the North than there was in the South. And so I actually would say that the Lực Văn Đoàn and its emphasis on language and literature and expression comes from the fact that they weren't allowed it, at least in the immediate context. And that's why you don't see the same kind of literary nationalism as you do in the North, as you do in the South, as you do in the North, right? They had a very much more open political discourse in the South. That's why you can have newspapers like, you could have newspapers in the South, that are much more political. Here you can't. So in many ways, the politics has to be filtered through literature and through literary expression. So that's my thought on that. About Phan Bội Châu, Phan Chu Trinh, their views in whether or not there's a kind of intellectual continuity or connection with their ideas of modernization. I also think this is a product of the colonial context of the time. The Lực Văn Đoàn were operating under this colonial context of being a protectorate, of increased censorship. And so for them, they didn't think about anti-colonialism in the same way as Phan Bội Châu or Phan Chu Trinh, right? I mean, Phan Bội Châu comes out and says, we need violent revolution. The Lực Văn Đoàn never says anything about violent revolution. Instead, they say, what can we do now to, we're not going to overthrow France, right? We don't know how long France is going to be there. We're just going to come up with a plan that we can build a Vietnamese nation. It doesn't matter who's in power, in France or whatever, we're not gonna, because if we overthrow France, what do we have to govern? Are we even a country that is, that has, that can govern itself? We need to build the institutions of civil society before we can think about things like anti-colonialism, overthrowing France, and then, nationhood. But our immediate responsibility is to, number one, build a informed electorate, right? Educated electorate, inculcate the values of, Republican democracy, these various sort of things, that was their less violent revolution. So I don't see a connection between, say, Phan Bội Châu and the Lực Văn Đoàn. And the third question, about, are there groups like that in the present day, these sort of everyday types of political activists. I mean, I'm not sure to the same extent. I mean, yeah, what's kind of unique about this group is that they had their paws in everything. They had irons in all sorts of fires. They messed around with fashion, and they were dabbling in, architecture, fine art, literature, theater. Yeah, you don't get that same breadth. I think in sort of modern times, political activism is so kind of narrowly defined that we don't have that same kind of, like, I guess, intellectual ebullience of the same kind, or the same kind of breadth of experimentation. So I think that's all the questions, but thank you very much for attending, and thank you so much to Ian and to the Weatherhead again for organizing this event.
I just want to reiterate the thanks, and we do have a few questions online, but we will forward them to the panelists and feature them on our website. So no questions will go unanswered. Thank you so much for your presence here and online, and for joining us today in this imagining of what might be in the future as a Vietnamese intellectual history. Thank you to the panelists and to you all.
So fun. Essay. It's so great. Like he was like, he basically said that people don't know how to laugh, and you're stupid, right? Like stupid people don't know how to laugh. Like it's, Oh, okay. I'm listening to it was a sign of, like, I guess, like ideological.
So, I'll let you know if I'm in post